Absolutely, music should not speak for itself. Yeah, I mean, this is a very hard line I'll draw in the sand. I mean, the idea that it can do that, I think, is really is coming from this place of, frankly, cultural arrogance. Yeah, no, music, whether it's music or art, it doesn't just speak for itself. I mean, obviously, there's a level. There is a non-verbal level at which we all experience music, and that's part of the joy of it. But at the end of the day, we invented language so that we could talk about the experiences that we have, and music definitely falls in that category.
Hey everybody, this is Chris from honestypill.com. You're listening to episode 26 of the Honesty Pill podcast. This season on the show, I'll be talking to people who are breaking the status quo, ditching outdated traditions, and building a better future for themselves and the people they work with. I'll be connecting you with musicians, sound healers, coaches, hip-hop artists, actors, composers, and people who not only inspire and educate every single day, but who are experts at talking about what they do so you can get inspired in your own work. My guest today is composer and founder of the Wizarding School for Composers. Can't wait to talk about that. Musician entrepreneur Joseph Sowa. So here's a question for you guys. Let me ask you this. You play music all the time, right? But have you ever written a piece of music? Do you even have a clue how you might go about trying to do that? And if you were going to work on writing a piece of music, how do you know when it's done? We're going to get a behind-the-scenes glimpse into what a professional composer's creative process looks like. So you've written a piece of music. Now, how do you get it performed? Joseph is going to talk about ways to effectively grow your network and connect with the people who have the connections to get your music on stage and performed. All right, here it comes. So I'm so excited to have you here on the podcast. Welcome to the Honesty Pill Show, Joseph Sowa.
Thanks, Chris. I'm excited to be here. It's been such a blast getting to know you over the past year or so to be on your podcast is really a thrill.
Likewise, but we haven't actually talked about any of this sort of topic, so I'm excited to crack into these things with you. So you're only the second composer I've had on this podcast, and we're going to get into all that, your composition work, your courses, the resources that you've created for other musicians who know what you want to do. But you are definitely the only person I know who has founded their own Wizarding School for Composers. So more on that program later. I'd like to set some context first. So you actually grew up playing violin and listening to classical radio, right? So did you come from a musical family?
Yeah, I came from a family of mostly musical amateurs. My grandma actually studied piano at the conservatory in Buenos Aires, and so she was a classically trained pianist. But my parents are just music lovers, and my mom plays the clarinet, my dad sings, and that's the environment that I was raised in.
Was it kind of expected that you would learn an instrument, or was it just such part of your culture that it just kind of happened?
I think it just kind of happened. There wasn't, my parents were great. They never really pressured me to do much of anything, but they were just always encouraging of if this is my interest, I'm going to feed it. So
I think that's actually brilliant parenting. I think when you try, I'm trying to figure this out with my own kids. If you try and encourage them, i.e. tell them what to do, it generally doesn't work out very well.
Yeah.
Probably the same thing for getting them to practice too, but we're still working on that. Did you have aspirations to become a soloist or work in an orchestra or?
Well, I think fairly early on, I recognized that performing wasn't really the thing that I was interested in. I liked playing. Playing was fun. But the thing about me and music was that I just wanted to create more of the kinds of sounds that I liked. And so I connected pretty early to composing as the thing that's interesting to me in music.
Did you do Suzuki?
I did not do Suzuki.
What was your methodology of learning the violin?
Actually, it was mostly just through the public schools. I had some good public school training there in Connecticut and worked great.
That's kind of not a thing anymore, though, for most schools. I'm the same way. We started band in 4th or 5th grade, and my dad played trumpet at home, so I had a little extra help. But the school really exposed me to band, orchestra, wind ensemble, jazz band. And that's not part of core curriculum in any of the public schools in California. So it's really kind of amazing that you had that opportunity.
Yeah, no, it was good. There's a great opportunity as well because when I started getting into composing in middle school, I wrote this piece the first piece that I had performed was for string orchestra, and my middle school orchestra director, she programmed it on the concert, and hearing that premiered for the first time was, still to this day was one of my biggest musical highs.
All right, so that's actually a question I have for you. It's kind of a 3-parter.
Yeah.
What's the first piece of music you ever remember writing? Part 2, what's the first piece of music that you wrote that someone else performed? And part 3, What's the first piece of music you wrote that someone else performed that you actually got paid for?
Yeah, so I remember writing some like little things here and there before I wrote that piece, but it was one of the first things that I wrote. The title is called "Scene for String Orchestra," was what it was called. We didn't have any violas in our orchestra, so they got orchestrated out. But
there's a viola joke in there somewhere.
There is, or there isn't, as the case may be. So that's the earliest one I remember. One of the earliest ones I remember writing. One of the earliest being performed. First, I got paid for. I think the first that I remember getting paid for was my first Barlow commission. I wrote a piece for saxophone, bass, piano, drums. It was for Eric Hansen, who is the double bass professor at Brigham Young University, and he was putting together a program to do at the International Society of Bassists Festival. So I wrote this piece for him called A Field Guide to Natural History. That was just a whole series of short, really kind of zany movements. I wrote it at the end of my undergrad, the start of my graduate degree.
That's amazing. And you got an actual check handed to you for that. How did it feel to get paid for that work?
Oh, it felt great. On the one hand, it felt great. On the other hand, that was probably one of the most excruciating pieces I ever wrote. It was like pulling teeth trying to write that piece.
Why? Why so?
Just a lot I was trying to put everything in the kitchen sink into this piece. I was trying this is going to be some sort of big statement piece. There's just a lot of other things about composing as well that I just hadn't figured out at that point. Things like certain mythology that I was still beholden to that we'll probably talk about later. And just attitudes that I had that was making it very difficult for me to write this piece. Even though I definitely had the technique to write it, that wasn't the problem. I mean, I had a finished piece at the end.
But I think what you're speaking to is something that every creative person who's ever tried to do anything this is my experience, is that you set out to do something, you get inspired or you get an idea or you get presented with a requirement that you have to present this thing, whatever it is. And then you instantly think, this is not going to be good enough, or I am not going to be good enough. So what I'm going to do is over-engineer and over-deliver this thing times 100. And I think a lot of people fall into that trap. And in the end, you end up reducing back, 80, 90% of what you put in there, and what's left over, hopefully, is something that you can use.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me.
That's something that I've worked on in my own stuff for sure. But let's talk about, for our listeners who are not composers and who have never written a note of music in their lives, for me, the idea of composing a piece of music seems daunting and super complicated. Can you give us a little sort of peek inside the process? How do you go from idea inside your head to music on paper? Or I guess you don't really use paper, do you?
I use paper sometimes. I mean, if this were not a podcast, I could show you that notebook that's right behind me I sometimes write stuff out. Generally speaking, my creative process isn't like a step-by-step kind of thing. I tend to think of it more in terms of there are these 6 basic workstations that I find myself in. And the process is the way that I jump around between these different workstations, and it looks different in every piece. So there's one workstation that I would think of in terms of consulting, where I'm talking with my collaborators, I'm talking with the people who commissioned the piece, and I'm trying to understand what their needs and what their values are. The next workstation, I tend to be there early on, but it gets used throughout the piece, is the connecting workstation, where I'm thinking, this is where I'm brainstorming. I'm trying to understand, okay, given these parameters from my collaborators, what's inspiring to me? What sort of connections can I make to other musical ideas, to extra musical things, that kind of stuff. And at some point, the rubber needs to hit the road and I need to start putting dots on a page. And from there, I feel like this is where the process gets really, fun and exciting, is that the very first thing I do is that I create sketches. In other words, incomplete fragments of music that are taking whatever my inspiration was and actually giving it some sort of musical expression. So I create, these sketches that are just fragments, and then I turn them into complete phrases. One of the things that I talk about often with my students is that the phrase is the shortest unit of a complete musical thought. And so until I take my fragments and I turn them into complete phrases, I don't actually know what I'm thinking musically. And so this is just a very helpful, useful step, is that I go from, okay, here are these fragments, they are by definition half-baked, and that's great. And then once I move them over into this, okay, let me make complete musical phrases, I'm beginning to understand my ideas more. But one of the things that I'm careful to do when I'm in that phase, at least, over the years I've learned to be careful to do, is to not put too much pressure into it. It's kind of like, when you're writing an email or when you're writing a blog post or something. The idea that you're trying to express doesn't really live in any single sentence that you write, Is that similarly when I'm writing phrases of music, it's like, if I write a phrase of music and it turns out that it doesn't actually express what I want, it's like, well, big deal, I'll write another one. I'm trying to chase after how to express what it is that I'm trying to say. And the only way that I can understand, am I getting close to this or not, is, well, I make a complete phrase, just like you start by writing a sentence and you turn those sentences into paragraphs and you go from there. So as the musical equivalent of that, the phrases compound into phrase groups and sections. What ends up happening is that I go from trying to take having complete phrases to polished phrases of, is this phrase exactly what it is that I'm trying to express? Is it playable? Is it interesting? Does it have like the magic that I'm trying to convey? And from there, once I've done that for, what ends up happening is, for me, I don't tend to write a piece from beginning to end. I tend to write like little pieces all over the place. And then once I have enough of it that I can structure a beginning, middle, and end, and then I fill in the gaps. Then it goes from start to finish. And so, through this process, I end up writing a complete piece of music. Once I have the whole thing from beginning to end, it's usually in a pretty polished place, and then I just go back and I polish it a little bit further, make the parts, proofread the score, do all those sorts of things, ship it out. That's generally speaking what happens. What also happens as well, even though like I've just discussed it in this linear process, is there's usually just a lot of back and forth. Like usually like, here is a partial piece of music, I am now going to send it to my collaborators, see what they think about it. How is this working? Is this something that they can play or can't they play it? Is this sort of capturing the mood that they hope that I'm writing for them or not?
All right, so here's two follow-up questions. Mm-hmm. Who's igniting this process most of the time for you? Is it you sit down to write a piece of music for a saxophone quartet or a chorus, or is a choral group calling you up and saying, hey, we need a piece for our centennial celebration, we'd like you to write it? Or is it a mixture of those?
It's a mixture of those. One of the things that's really fun about being a composer and being a musician is just the opportunity that you have to collaborate with people. And that collaboration can start in either direction of, hey, I've really enjoyed working with you, I'd love to write a piece for you. Or, they come to me and say, hey, we have this event or this concert that we have in mind, can you write a piece for us?
I have to admit, from before this moment, I kind of thought of your work more as, not you personally, but a composer's work as a much more solitary experience where you'd be holed up in a studio late at night or early, like whenever your time to work is, scrawling the stuff down, and then the first time anybody really hears it is when it's the first rehearsal. But it seems like there's a lot of intermediary steps between you and the people who are programming or going to perform that music.
Yeah, I mean, depending on the timeline and depending on what I'm writing, there absolutely can be. I mean, some composers are more solitary about it, but I think there are many of us that, we sit in a room because we have to, but we like people. So
it's good to like people you work with. Exactly.
Yeah.
Where did you come up with this sort of systematized stations? Because it sounds like, hearing you describe your process, I've never written a book either, although it's something on my to-do list, that would be a similar process I would go to organize a book. What's the main point of the book? What are the chapters going to be? What are the main takeaways? And then constructing it that way. Did you have a mentor or someone who helped you develop this, or is this born out of necessity for you?
I was born out of necessity. I mean, I'm glad that you asked that question about, what was the first piece I got paid for, because that piece lit a fire under me. Like, it was excruciating trying to write that piece. And I was like, never again. If I'm going to be a composer, I need to be able to do it in such a way that I have emotional energy left over for other things. Like, it turns out that I have a family and I have friends and I have a life that, when I'm composing, I can't have all of my emotional energy being sucked away by my composing. And so that started essentially a decade-long process of figuring out, okay, what does an ideal creative process look like? How can I be effective as a composer such that it just doesn't drain me? And so, lots of trial and error, lots of reading and talking with people. But what really happened with this particular creative process, I remember where it was when I thought of it. I was driving down, what's that freeway? I want to say it's the 91 in Connecticut. Part of me wants to say that I was going to IKEA, or maybe I was going to New York or something. Whatever the case, I was past Hartford and I was heading in the direction of New York. And the thought occurred to me. I was thinking about creative process stuff, and I was like, the thing that people get wrong about creative process is they think about it like it's a timeline. Creative process is not a timeline. What if instead of thinking about it temporally, you thought about it spatially? Is that creative process is this space that you're in. And the process itself, in other words, how you move through this through time is just however it is that you move from workstation to the next. And what I've found in my own creative process and in talking with my students and colleagues is that this just matches what people do so much better than thinking, okay, first you have this stage, then you have this stage, and maybe you might go back to this stage, but it's not really that sort of thing. And this sort of like creative process timeline makes you feel like, I don't know, it just puts like handcuffs on the creative process in a way that just doesn't line up with my experience. In my experience, I will tend, I am now spending 15 minutes sketching, and then maybe I'll spend, maybe 2 hours putting those together into phrases. And then maybe I'll spend like another 30 minutes talking with collaborators, and then another, 10 minutes polishing the piece. It just bounces around. And there's, so like this workspace image, I think, matches what it is that I'm doing a lot better than any sort of timeline.
I think it also probably helps you stay on focus of what specific component of your creativity you're working on at that moment. Because I imagine it would be hard to put containers and buckets around these things, and everything can kind of get blurred together and then get overwhelming and hard to metric out whether you're actually doing anything. So here's a question. How do you know when it is done?
That's a great question. In some ways the answer to that is it's done when you have no more time to work on it.
Exactly.
But I would give, so that's the first easy answer, but here are some other things that I'd give when it's done. It's done when it meets the requirements of your collaborator. As musicians, we're often like hesitant to think of what we're doing in these sorts of business terms. And it's like, oh, this is just a product, it's just a deliverable. But there is a certain reality where that is the case, where it's like if it meets the needs of the people who commissioned it, then it's done. Another way of thinking about it too, I think one of the more artistic and salient ways is that I generally know in my gut when a piece is done. There comes a point where I recognize where it's like, okay, now I'm just like fiddling with details. Like, is this capture the big picture point of what I'm after? Or is everything polished enough that I wouldn't be embarrassed about putting this out in the world? And yeah, that's for me, when it hits that level of this feels right, and I can look at it and say, this is good enough, then it's done and I just put it out there.
When people listen to music, they connect with certain things, right? There is a genre, there's the instrumentation, there's the distinct style of the person who wrote the music coming through. But there are certain composers that when you hear them, right away you're listening to Mozart or Brahms or Steve Reich or John Adams. They seem to have a very distinct voice that is both unique and recognizable. So what's the difference between the style of a composer and then actually having a voice?
That's you're asking the hard-hitting questions, Chris.
Awesome.
Yeah. To a certain extent, I would actually push back a little bit on your assertion that, someone like Steve Reich or Mozart or Brahms is identifiable. Because the question is identifiable for whom? I think even for many classically trained musicians, if you're to just drop the needle on, a random late 18th century Viennese piece, they couldn't tell you if this is Mozart or Haydn or one of their other contemporaries. I mean, it's clear that whole like scene had a very distinctive style to it, but the nuances of this is Haydn versus this is Mozart can be kind of blurry sometimes. Similar sort of thing in contemporary day and age, particularly with minimalism having become such the force that it is. I think Steve Reich is a little bit easier to identify, but someone like Philip Glass, for instance, there are so many pieces now that sound like Philip Glass's music. It can just be really hard to say. So all of this is to say, like, I think that voice, there's more to do with voice than simply style. Your voice as much has to do with the stories that you tell about your music to yourself and to others. And it has much to do with the relationships that you have with other people. Like, how is it that you're putting yourself out into the world musically? Or you have some sort of like adversarial, you must pay attention to me kind of thing like Beethoven? Or are you approaching things in more of like a collaborative community building kind of way? Who's your audience? Who are you speaking to? I mean, that has, again, as much to do with your voice as anything stylistic. So yeah, this tends to be a whole other thing I talk about. I think, so those three elements plus the processes that you have in your place to make your music, I think of these things, it's the intersection of these four things that are your voice. It's kind of like a Bach chorale, that you have a soprano, alto, a tenor, and a bass. The soprano would be your stories. It's the thing that people immediately notice about your music. For musicians, we might be a little bit shocked and offended. It's like, no, people should notice my music. People should notice my style. And it's like, well, no, that's not actually. People tend to notice, like, the thing that they take away tends to be the stories that they tell themselves about the music or that others have told about the music. So this is your story. This is the melody of the chorale. This is the soprano, right? The alto of the chorale, altos in a chorale tend to be like the most unappreciated voice in the chorale. They're the one that gets all the grunt work. This is like your process. That, if it, when it's working, people don't notice it. But when it's missing, they're like, something's missing here. The tenor voice in the chorale is, would be comparable to your technique or to your style. And, I'm a tenor, so I can say this in part, but, tenors tend to think that they're the center of the universe. But this tenor voice is not the most important voice in the chorale. It's, it's definitely a contributor. It's a key player. But the things that really make a difference in the chorale are the soprano, your stories. And then the last one that we're talking about is the bass, your relationships. I mean, whether that's individual relationships or the relationships that you have with institutions or communities, this is the foundation on which everything rests. For my money, your artistic voice is the harmonization of those four different facets.
That's amazing. And imagine in the beginning, you're studying great composers like Bach and Brahms and all these other people to learn their techniques and their voices and maybe even mimicking them to a certain degree. You hear whiffs of John Williams music all over the place, but I can say that I can recognize his voice right away. Even in different styles that he's written, I can still hear John Williams music. So I think that's pretty powerful. Here's a pretty basic question, but I'm really curious. So if I'm an orchestral musician and I'd like to get a job, I send a resume and I take an audition. There's a very clear path to that process, and I get the job or I don't. And you obviously have a lot of connections already. You're in it, you're doing things, you're getting your work performed, you have collaborators. But for somebody who's starting out in this space and they've already overcome the hurdle of, staring at that blank page and figuring out the systems to structure the idea in their head to get it on paper, how do you actually get your music performed? How do you get the music into the hands of the people who program it so that your work will be performed? I'm talking about networking, I guess, here.
Yeah, well, that is the answer. Something that Seth Godin talks about a lot is this idea of wanting to be picked, and how we live in a day and age when not only do the gatekeepers have less power to make all of our hopes and dreams come true, but that there's less need for them as well. A lot of times, composers, just the nature of, you're going to these classically music-focused institutions, just a lot of like this institutional mindset just seeps in, particularly if you're a classical musician, but even if you're a jazz musician going to a conservatory or something, you're thinking in these, you're trained to think in these very institutional kinds of terms, which is, if you do good enough, you will be picked, and you need to apply to all the things. And you need to appease the gatekeepers, and that's the way that you get ahead. And as a composer, your first instinct is probably going to be if you're a young composer, your first instinct is going to be, okay, let me let me send my music out to a bunch of calls for scores. Let me apply to a bunch of competitions. And, maybe if I'm more enterprising, I might put my music up for sale on Sheet Music Plus or something, and I'll advertise. As I'm going to advertise my music, is that you're thinking about your music like it's Coke or something, that you can just market it, and simply based on that, people will come to it. All of these things are valuable, but they're not. But they're like orders of magnitude less valuable than the kind of networking that you're talking about. Like, this hands down, like the best way to get your music performed, to get your music commissioned, is you gotta make friends. And you gotta sustain these friendships over the course of years. There is no fast way to getting your music out there. We could talk more about that, but that's my initial answer.
People are not connecting with your music per se; they're connecting with you as a human being, and
exactly
and the voice and the vibration that you're putting out there. Well, it's like anything else. I mean, people give jobs to the people that they know because they know that they exist. So you've got to be visible in that space and help people understand why they should be interacting with your program, your music, whatever it is that you're putting out there.
Let me just build on that. Is that until you've developed a reputation, your music it's not going to do that work for you. Part of the reason that people just reflectively program Beethoven is because, Beethoven has, hundreds of years of reputation that has been building up. You probably have none. Or, maybe just a handful of years with a select group of people. The thing that develops the reputation is the networking. It's the developing relationships with other people. And so that's always good. It's always going to be that. Even if you do get to like a John Williams level, I can guarantee you that John Williams over the course of his career has been very deliberate about cultivating relationships. And you just look at how he acts in interviews. He's such a gentleman. I mean, if I were an orchestral musician, I'd love to work with John Williams.
Everybody wants to work with John Williams. He's just such a powerful inspiration. LA Phil, as you probably can guess, does a lot of premieres. I think we did pre-pandemic when we were doing our regular stuff. I think we had 50 premieres per season, which is almost a new piece every single week. And sometimes when that music gets in front of the musicians for the first times, our jaws drop and we say, oh my God, what has this person written for me? And, this has like gone beyond the capabilities of my instrument or my technique. How do you know where to draw the line between writing what's appropriate so that your music will actually have a chance of being performed and pushing the envelope to test the boundaries of what's possible? I mean, pushing the envelope is not just musically, but technically and physically and all those things.
Well, it depends on who your collaborators are. I mean, to a certain extent, I feel for you and your colleagues, Chris, because it's just like there's a certain point beyond which it's just silly to write needlessly complicated music. But on the other hand, I mean, the LA Phil is like the top of the game, like I think a lot of composers would justifiably feel emboldened to write really hard music that they otherwise couldn't write for, a middle school band or something. So I do think that there's a balancing act there. For me personally, I would want to err on the side of what is the most technically efficient way that I can express my musical idea. I don't want to, write you weird multiphonics if I don't have to.
We appreciate that, by the way. Well, I was kind of thinking too, not only of technique, but there's a composer I'm thinking of who writes really complicated rhythmical juxtapositions of triplets, inside quintuplets with rests and ties, and all these really hard to look at things that when you actually play them, they don't sound as complicated as they look. But there is a certain, I don't know how to describe this, but like a feeling that happens when you're playing that person's music that it's them. And I'm actually talking about Thomas Addis. I'm not surprised by that. Yeah, I mean, some of his stuff, you're like, oh my God, I need to get out a calculator here to figure out where to put these notes. But something really magical happens when you're playing his music. When he's doing that thing, it's him, and it just has a certain quality and I'm glad he pushed me to figure out the rhythms, because what we produced was really cool.
Well, I think the thing that Addis has going for him is that he's just, two things he has going for him. Is this just like he's just so musically insightful. I mean, tremendously musically insightful. of what it is that he's writing. I mean, he's a composer that if he's writing you hard stuff, he's doing it for a reason. Is that he's actually after a specific musical effect, and he's doing it deliberately. And that I guess that's just related to the other thing too, is, talking about the musical insight, is that there is actually like an expressive musical payoff to it, but like there's also all of this, intellectual stuff that's happening behind it as well, that, the more deeply that you study into Otis's scores, they make a ton of sense. I actually wrote my dissertation on Tevot. I know that piece very well. And yeah, no, it's this really wonderful combination of being, on the one hand, super brainy, but also I think it's one of his most sincere, heartfelt pieces. Like it's a very emotionally rich piece.
He's a pianist, isn't he?
Yeah.
So, and also, by the way, one of the most kind, empathetic, thoughtful human beings you could ever want to work with, too. He's just a joy to collaborate with. Here's a question going back to your roots as a violinist that I wanted to ask. Are there any theoretical composers out there? And what I mean by that is people who have not actually learned an instrument, but just sort of write music.
Yeah, they're kind of few and far between. Like, they exist. I might slightly lump myself into that category. I don't really consider myself a professional level performer. Like, I'm a professional level composer, but for performers, it's just like, yeah, not really. I do think that there are things about music you can't really understand unless you perform it. I mean, even at like the mediocre level that I perform it, there are things about it you just can't understand unless you're there making it in real time.
I had a conductor once who used to constantly shout chamber music at the orchestra because he wanted us to actually listen to each other, which is something that you can only understand if you have performed in a small group and know what that feels like. So I think it's the composers I enjoy playing are the ones who I think are musicians first and then have something to say. Andrew Norman is another one who comes to mind. His music is just so attached. And here's a question for you. Mm-hmm. Should music speak for itself in terms of when you walk out on stage and you see Beethoven is being performed? You know exactly what you're going to hear when you hear Beethoven 5. Nobody has to come out and explain that to you. But when there's a premiere, no one's ever heard this piece before. Do you want to give a preamble? Do you want to give notes and tell people what to listen for, where it came from, or do you just want to let it unfold?
Yeah, I absolutely, music should not speak for itself. I mean, this is a very hard line I'll draw in the sand. I mean, the idea that it can do that, I think, is really coming from this place of, frankly, cultural arrogance. Beethoven does not speak for Beethoven. The only reason that Beethoven speaks for himself is because we've been living with Beethoven for hundreds of years. Likewise, even in Beethoven's day, he had the virtue of the fact that in terms of stylistically, he started out roughly in the same page as everybody else. And as he drifted out into being more, what was experimental at the time, Beethoven 100% spoke for Beethoven. I mean, the stories are legion of, Beethoven bullying publishers and aristocrats to try and get his way and, put his music out there. And so, yeah, no, music, whether it's music or art, it doesn't just speak for itself. I mean, obviously there's a level, there is a non-verbal level at which we all experience music, and that's part of the joy of it. But at the end of the day, we invented language so that we could talk about the experiences that we have. And, music definitely falls in that category.
And we'll be right back. I want to give a huge thanks to the sponsor of the Honesty Pill podcast, Yamaha Corporation of America. I've been playing Yamaha equipment for decades in my own practice room, on stage with the Los Angeles Philharmonic, or touring all over the world, and Yamaha has been an absolute game changer. Something I love about Yamaha is the way they pursue excellence in all of their work and at all levels. They are as dedicated to bringing quality work for beginning students as they are for marquee artists. I admire their commitment to continuous improvement and creating a community that includes all of the musicians they serve. Make every note count, play Yamaha. Okay, let's get back to the show. I'm glad that you said that. And I'm glad you called me out saying Beethoven speaks for himself, because the concerts that we do that I think have the most impact are the ones where we have someone come out and give a quick preamble and give them something to listen to maybe that they didn't know before they walked in, whether it's Bach or Bartok or a brand new piece that no one's ever heard. I love that. So you created a resource that you describe as the ultimate program for composers, arrangers, and musicians who want to make their music more vivid, sophisticated, and magical. and I'm talking about the Wizarding School for Composers. I thought maybe we could talk about this topic a little bit with some myths that are involved in our industry here. And I've got one I want to throw at you first, which is, do you have to be inspired to write good music?
Thanks for bringing this up, but the answer is no. You don't have to be inspired to write good music. What tends to happen, and there's a great Tchaikovsky quote about this that I don't remember off the top of my head, but inspiration is just as often chronologically second as it is first. Typically, when people talk about inspiration, what they're referring to good, clear ideas. They're referring to, oh, this idea is good enough that I now feel motivated to write something. But the challenge is that when you're connecting your ideas to your motivation, it's very easy not to want to do anything. And this lack of good ideas, this lack of, okay, I don't have any good ideas, therefore I don't feel motivated. This is one of the main reasons that people procrastinate, is that they use deadlines in order to force inspiration. And there's a certain real-world truth to this. If you're Hans Zimmer or somebody and you have like 3 or 4 weeks to write a film score, the inspiration will have to come on that timetable. But whether you're working in Hollywood or whether you're more of a concert composer, relying on deadlines is kind of like an inspiration placebo. It enables you to confront avoiding what inspiration actually is. If you want to get like psychological for a little bit moment, I do think that there's a key ego aspect to this. It's a paradox, because on the one hand, artists, to a certain extent, some artists egotistically want to feel like they're drawing down these great ideas from thin air, that this somehow is proving your artistic worthiness of just, out of nothing, just immediately you can write it and it's just you're transcribing it. But ironically, like the paradox is that if you do that, this is also going to deepen your insecurities because you feel you've done nothing to deserve what you've received. So for me, the way out of this is to not think about inspiration in terms of good ideas. It's instead, the way that I tend to think about inspiration is about meaning. It's about connecting the dots of, why do I care about this thing that I'm creating? And connecting the dots of, why should others care about this thing that I'm creating? I mean, these dots are subjective and they lead all over the place. I mean, we could talk about, like, there are musical reasons why I care about what I'm creating. There are extra musical reasons. Some of these reasons are very personal. Some of these reasons are more universal. But regardless of, the why I care and why I think you, Chris, should care when you're playing my piece, is this sort of inspiration, this inspiration as meaning, is it's something that I can choose to deliberately cultivate. And I think what's even more awesome about thinking about inspiration in these terms is that it's not a one and done kind of thing, is that as I create more music, I can understand my inspiration better. And as I understand my inspiration better, that will, inspire more music. And as I make more music, that will in turn feed in and understand my inspiration. Well, let me give you an example of this. One of my more recent commissions was a piece for Hub New Music. They're a fantastic chamber group out here in Boston. And the piece ended up being called Apple Fantasy. And it's divided into 6 sections, and it sort of envisions this like 24-hour period at an apple orchard. That was not the initial inspiration for the piece at all. Like what I was actually thinking about when I started writing the piece was I was thinking about growing up in Orange County and all the orange groves that used to be there. And somehow or another, it morphed into this apple orchard kind of thing. And that's kind of how it worked.
That thing you're talking about, when that inspiration comes from you and you're getting it written into the music, I think that's palpable by the people who perform it. So if you are asking, why should I care about the piece that you wrote? I think that I can tell instantly when I start playing it if there's something there, because there's something to connect to. And then I actually get inspired. What's crazy for my job is I feel like I don't have a lot of creativity. What I'm doing is trying to interpret and execute and take the instructions that hopefully the composer and the conductor together have written and communicated to me, and then try and present that in the clearest way I can. But the inspiration part, I think, is baked in or it's not. And there are definitely pieces where I walk out of the hall thinking, well, I don't even remember what I just did. And then other nights I feel transformed by that. And I think it's intangible, but it has to be in there. Talk a little bit about your mind and heart working together to create inspiration?
So if inspiration is this sort of like connecting kind of thing, right? Then some of these connections need to be both like intellectual and emotional. I think, and depending on what kind of composer you are, some of the you face different challenges. For performers who compose, but especially for amateurs, they tend to have this problem where they just try and write from their heart or their instinct, and they're just like, oh, the music is just going to flow out of me. And you run into so many problems when you do that. Is talking about this is again this view of inspiration that it's outside of you, it's not something that you can control. And a lot of why they're running into this problem is they're not using their minds nearly as much as they should. The opposite of that is that oftentimes highly trained composers, they tend to write this music that over relies on intellect and calculation because, there are various reasons why, composers in academia or other highly trained composers tend to do this. But if you are relying too much on this intellectual calculation, you think that music is some sort of like head game, then you're only giving a very select group of people things that they can connect with about your music. And that might, if those are the only people you want to connect with, then that's great, you're good to go. If you want to connect with a broader group of people, but just doing stuff with your mind isn't sufficient.
All right, true or false? Ordinary performers cannot compose.
100% false. 100% false. Like the inspiration myth, this one tries to make composing into this gift. Either you have it or you don't, which I think is stupid. Everyone on this planet speaks some kind of language. By default, everyone can do music. So when we're talking about doing music, I mean, the fundamental reason everyone can compose is that composing is about elaborating on patterns, many of which you don't invent. So, if I were to, talk with you, Chris, about, how can I help you become a composer? It's like, well, let's find some patterns that you can elaborate with and reorganize, because that is literally all composing is one of the things that we've inherited is this really unfortunate romantic notion that, composing is doing things that have never been done. And that's just full of crock. Like, so much of, even if you were somebody like Milton Babbitt, you are relying on a lot of stuff that has been done before. It might not seem like it, but you are relying on a lot of stuff that's been done before. So the challenge that a lot of performers face is that the training that they've received at conservatory or particularly at universities doesn't teach them how to write. It treats writing music as this separate thing from theorizing and analyzing music. Recently, I wrote a blog post where I got a lot of flack for this idea that music theory doesn't teach you how to write music because, for some people, this just sort of seems self-evident. In fact, for many people, they think, well, performers don't need to be able to compose and they, should be able to compose. Or that there's this separate discipline of theory that's valuable on its own terms to composers. And it's like, well, the kinds of things that theory are talking about, well, you don't need to apply that for theorists and composers. They'll figure that out on their own. The big thing that we need to understand is that this is not how musicians used to be trained in Europe at all. This is 100% a byproduct of the university system. So this was something that just absolutely blew my mind. One of the most groundbreaking scholars, in some ways, because he's sort of rediscovering what we were doing in the past, is a emeritus professor from Northwestern called Robert Gerdigan. And what he wrote this book called Child Composers in Old Conservatories. And what he explains in the book towards the end is that a lot of what it is that we think about music theory and the way that university curriculum is structured, this is 100% a result that this is being taught in a university over the course of, 2 years or 4 years or whatever. And it's a response to the fact that, you just do not have time in a typical university degree to teach music with the amount of depth and nuance that you would back when orphans were being put in conservatories and learning how to do music there. Part of the change as well is the fact that, again, going into a university, this was turned into an intellectual discipline rather than a practical one. And something that he, in recent interviews that he's talked about as well, is this idea that, in America, we don't like to talk about the class distinction, but there is very much a classism kind of thing that's happening in universities here, is that, the musicians worked with their hands. This was a trade. Whereas the people that went to university hired those musicians. And so they would take courses in geology, but that didn't mean that they knew how to mine coal. Or, you take you take a course in music theory, for instance, you take a course in harmony. And so you learned about harmony. You didn't actually learn it with the kind of rigor that Haydn or Mozart or any of those composers learned it when they were in a conservatory, because that's not the point of a university education. The point is you read a little bit of this, you learn some music theory, you take a course on US government, just whatever, and it's this, and that's the result, is you learn about things.
Oh, it's excellent points. I love it. All right, how about this one? Composing music is overwhelming because there are too many details. And I am the first one. This is a huge myth that I can't wait to hear your take on. And I always go back to the same piece because it was the most vivid experience of this, listening to John Adams' The Gospel According to the Other Mary. I still can't understand how he wrote that. It is such a complex piece of work. It's enormous. How do you manage all the details of a piece like that, or even something small?
Yeah, well, it goes back to that whole, to be trite about it, it goes back to that whole thing about how do you eat an elephant, just one bite at a time, right? But a lot of, let's take that example, for instance. Composer, if you're someone like John Adams, you're writing this very intricate music, and it's, at a very high level, and it's truly excellent. When we talk about this intricate music, right, and you talk about someone like John Adams, you talk about someone that has, spent, decades developing his craft. The thing about craft is that it's often not a product of intellectual brilliance as much as it is of applied perceptiveness. In other words, if you're like John Adams, or if you're like Thomas Adès, who we've mentioned earlier, right, you've really honed the ability to zero in on specific details, to spot very specific patterns, and to identify how all these details and patterns work together to create a particular kind of effect. So that's one aspect of being able to write this intricate music. Another aspect of it is actually something that's a little bit more banal, is that, frankly, you've just internalized thousands of patterns to the point that you can just use them without thinking. Which is a lot like, speaking English. Most of us have a vocabulary. There's the baseline vocabulary that they talk about of having 2,000 words. I think many people have a vocabulary that's larger than that. You don't think about the words that you use, you just use them. John Williams orchestrator Herb Spencer talked about this in relation to orchestration. He said that to be a successful orchestrator, you need to have a vocabulary of 1,000 sounds or so. And he was talking about, what does it sound like when you have the first and second violins playing in octaves? What does it sound like when you have the first violins and the violas playing in octaves? What does it sound like when, the flutes and the clarinets are doubling those first violins and violas? These are the kinds of things that Herb Spencer was talking about. This applies just as much to counterpoint, is that there are contrapuntal gestures that you can learn as well, where it's this, sequence of notes tends to match up with this sequence of notes, and these are these different ways of elaborating them. And composers, you can have a conscious knowledge of that, but particularly, I was talking earlier about how composers used to be trained. The whole point of how composers used to be trained was to enable them to develop an unconscious, instinctive knowledge of all these contrapuntal gestures, such that they could see a bass line, and just simply from the bass line, they would understand what the implications of it were. So if you're someone like John Adams, he wasn't necessarily trained specifically in that way, but you have developed a level of craft such that, again, you've just internalized thousands of patterns, such that getting very intricate with these patterns isn't that hard for you, because using these patterns, they're just already second nature.
It still sounds like it would be really overwhelming, but I feel like there's a gauntlet thrown, because I have all those patterns in my head too, as a performer who studied music for my whole career. It would be an interesting challenge for every musician who's a performer to write a piece of music.
Oh, absolutely. And here's the thing, is that one of these mythologies is that, you need to have this Bach or Brahms or Berg level of intellectual rigor, or just it needs to be that you need to have that sort of oh my goodness, I cannot understand what's happening in this music, like you have with John Adams. This is just one way of writing meaningful music. For instance, the level of craft that's required to write Morton Lauridsen's O Magnum Mysterium is just not the same as what it takes to write that John Adams piece, or to write, for Berg to write Wozzeck. Now, for my money, Morton Lauridsen's choral piece, it's just as great a piece as those other two. Is it an intellectually equal accomplishment? Of course not. But there are plenty of other axes of how you can create musical magic besides just sheer intellectual force. And so something like O Manuum Mysterium, it's like, well, this is accomplishable by normal people. Like you don't have to be a genius that has spent decades learning different musical patterns to write something like that.
All right, I hear what you're saying, and my imposter syndrome and fear are saying no, but I'm going to try. I'm gonna write something.
I think the important thing is just to get out of your head about it, right? Like your goal is to not equal Brahms. That's not the goal. Because, like I said, at the end of the day, your voice is more than your technique. Your voice is just as much your process, it's just as much the stories, it's just as much the relationships. And, like I value our relationship, when we're talking to each other. It's like, you don't sound like Shakespeare. I don't sound like Shakespeare. Like that's not why we value the connection. It's because of what it is that we talk about. And so likewise in your music, it's like, use the technique that you have, own the technique that you have, but the thing that you're trying to communicate is so much more than the technical level of accomplishment that you have.
So what would you say is sort of the punch of the Wizarding School? What do you get out of it? If you take the program, how do you actually debunk some of those myths that we were talking about earlier?
Well, in 4 different ways. The program is designed first, I want to help you see the craft forest, so to speak, for the trees. So often it's very easy to just get like myopically focused on, well, this note, that rhythm, whatever. And it's like, no, I want you to see the forest for the trees such that, that can just lessen the anxiety of, oh, am I choosing the right chord? Am I, writing the right melody? If you can see the forest for the trees, then that just makes the composing so much easier. So that's the first thing that's designed to do. And so what we do is we go over, we talk about how melody works. We talk about, actually how to write a memorable melody. This is something that, ironically, sometimes they talk about it in university, but it just tends to be skimmed over. But you'd think that, how to write a good melody would be something that they talk about. It's not actually all that much of a mystery. So we talk about stuff like that. The second thing that we do in the Wizarding School for Composers is I help you connect with the classical tradition that was lost to university education. So something I'm super stoked about this current round of the Wizarding School for Composers that's starting in February is I'm bringing in my colleague Ian Campbell, and he's going to teach you the beginnings of this Italian tradition, the kind of tradition that produced composers like Verdi and Scarlatti, and even was influential on people like on Haydn and Mozart in a roundabout kind of way. So he's going to teach you these partimenti, and what it is doing for you is it's teaching you to begin to recognize these patterns. As you're going to begin to have this repertoire of patterns that you can start to see the connections of, and you can identify them and spot them and learn how to elaborate them. Likewise, another thing that I talked about craft as well, and what it is that means. I'm going to teach you the kind of analysis that's not focused on, scoring theoretical points or making sure that you label this chord or this form correctly, but on understanding how it is that elements work together to create musical effects. Theory is fundamentally incapable of doing this because the whole purpose of theory is to say this is how music works generally, or this is how this repertoire works generally. Whereas in analysis, it's very different than that. You're looking at, well, what is the effect of this specific choice? And more often, well, what is the effect of this coordination of choices? And this is, probably the biggest question that you have to deal with as a composer is like, well, as I'm writing this melody, how can I support this harmonically? How can I support this in the arrangement such that it can have the most powerful impact? And there's no theoretical answer to that. You need to be able to look at the way that these things are being coordinated and say, well, what's the effect of these choices? So these are all on the craft level, right? Those first 2 things I mentioned. The third and the fourth thing have more to do with process. From as a result of going all over this craft stuff, I'm also going to teach you the process systems that you need to have in place so that you can get out of your head and you can create an effective, joyful process, such that even if you aren't feeling quotes unquote inspired, you can show up to work every day, whether that's I have only 5 minutes or I have 5 hours, and you can work effectively regardless. Through the process of all these, the biggest thing is you're going to learn how to really own your voice by connecting your inspiration to the nitty-gritty details of composing. And so, as a result, like I said, you can compose without the anxiety, without the confusion, without the self-judgment, and you can be able to wield all those elements of musical magic such that you can give your audience goosebumps, you can take their breath away, and you can connect with them on a really meaningful, personal basis.
Get out of your head and create an effective, joyful, creative process. Let me actually say that one more time. Get out of your head and create an effective, joyful, creative process. I think right there, that is worth the price of admission for anyone taking a program. I love it. Amazing.
Well, it's the program that I wish I had. I mean, like when I was a younger composer, I was so in my head. I was so in my head. And, you know, the things that it took me more than a decade to learn, it doesn't take that long to learn this. Like you can legitimately begin to make massive strides only over the course of the 4 months of the program to just relaxing and making it joyful.
Brilliant. I love that. I have to talk to you about one other aspect of what you do, the work that you're doing, because it's so relevant to the type of coaching that I do and the thing that I stand for, where musicians who have such a high level of knowledge and skill like you do, taking that into a totally different space, and that is creating a business out of it. What was the moment that you decided, I think I can turn this into not only a business that generates income, that gives me the power to do what I want to do, but that really serves other musicians and help taking the anxiety out of that creative process? When did you and why did you start creating a business out of this?
Well, there were two moments. The first moment was the realization that I didn't have to teach at a university to impact musicians in this way. Like once I realized that, you know, there are plenty of opportunities outside the university to educate musicians and to do these sorts of things. Like that was very freeing. I mean, the idea of not having to throw my hat into the ring with 300 other applicants just to compete with one job. It's like, great, I'm not going to do that. I mean, I wouldn't mind teaching at university at some point, but whatever. As I was developing, how is it that I can best serve composers? That was when I first developed this framework of, you know, the 4 parts, the 4-part chorale of the empowered composer, talking about, you know, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, the stories, process, technique, and relationships. But as I was thinking about that, the real and you know, honing over that idea, the thing that I just kept on coming back to is that a lot of composers aren't ready for that yet. They've just so internalized this idea that in order to become a successful composer, you need to have a really unique style. You need to that there's this technical element to it. That if they just get the technique right, then everything else will just magically take care of itself. And so there is this, well, let me meet them where they are kind of thing. Of let me create a program that will help them see the forest for the trees about technical things and about process things, such that they can recognize that, you know, for a lot of the students that I teach, there is a baseline of competence beyond which people start to care far less about your technique and a lot more about what it is that you bring to the table as a person and as a creator generally. And just helping them get to that point where they can just let go of the technical things and the process things, getting them so that that stuff is in place. That was the realization of just like this is the need. They needed to feel this freedom and security that and the way that I would encapsulate it is be able to say to themselves, you know what, I'm not yet as great of a composer as I hope to be, but I'm already a far better composer than I need to be.
That's awesome. But this program, the Wizarding School, is not for beginner composers or like high school level. Who is it actually for?
Yeah, so the program is designed for its best effect is for classically trained musicians. And so whether that's you have an undergraduate degree or even, you know, I've had students in the Wizarding School for composers that have doctorates. That's who the program is for. I've also had students who don't have formal education, but you know, there's a certain baseline of the program isn't designed to teach you theory. It's designed to build on you already have the basics of music down.
Well, there's your open door, listener, to if you want to start composing and you're not a theoretical composer or went to school for composing, wizarding school would be a great entry point for you to try and figure out, how do I actually take this idea from up here and put it out? And I think, I've never thought about this, Joseph, but I definitely stand for all performers should teach, should share that knowledge, and find a way to make their aspects of how they play and what they do very communicatable and very concise, unlike the sentence that I just said, which was very weird. And then all educators really need to get up on stage and perform frequently so they can remember what it feels like for their students who they're asking to do the same thing. And I'm now realizing there's a third part to this, which is we should write. We should all be writing a little bit. For one thing, it would probably give us more empathy to composers who are struggling, and maybe we're a little bit judgmental of what's on the stand, because that's a defense mechanism for musicians. You've probably encountered that too. Mm-hmm. Like, can't believe you wrote this. Well, you're like, well, give it a shot. Try, push yourself a little bit. I think if I wrote something, maybe I would be a little bit more kind to that next composer that comes along for the work that they're doing. I don't know. It's an interesting idea. When does your program occur? Where does it occur? How can people find out about it?
So my program it's essentially what I ended up creating was was my own university course. And so I run it on like a semesterly kind of basis. It's a 4-month program. The next round of the Wizarding School for Composers starts February 15th. And all of the details for that you can find on my website, which is just my name, josephsowa.com.
And people can hop on a call and send you an email, ask questions, that kind of thing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely they can. Even before the program starts. What I do, so this is the Wizarding School for Composers. The idea, like you said earlier, Chris, was I help composers make musical magic for themselves and others, to take the anxiety, the confusion, the self-judgment out of the creative process, and to make music that gives audiences goosebumps, that takes their breath away and just rivets them. That's the goal of the program. And so like any good proper wizarding school, I have a sorting hat that, I give to you and we put on. And so we have this call where we talk about your music, we talk about your goals, we talk about any obstacles that you're facing, and explore whether the wizarding school could be a good fit for you.
I love the branding that you've chosen, and I think everybody listening would like to get the sorting hat and find out what category they fit into. I have 2 more questions for you, real quick ones. Mm-hmm. Who would you say your top 2 or 3 composer, mentor, or influences would be? Like, if we listen to your music, who are we hearing hints of? That's
a great question. I think in terms of, you're never going to hear it. I don't think you're really going to hear it in terms of the sound, but in terms of mentors, like, I just have to give a shout out to my professors at Brandeis. They're huge in formulating how it is that I write and helping me understand how music works in a way that, again, enabled me to let go of my hangups and that sort of stuff and just write. So to be specific, Eric Chazalo, Yue Chang, David Rukowski, Marty Boykin, the late Marty Boykin. He actually just passed away this past year, which is unfortunate. And Erin Gee came late, but she's great too. But yeah, no, they were just all of them. A lot of the ways that I think about music is so indebted to them, even if my music doesn't really sound like them all that much.
It's been synergized into your own voice, as you said before.
Yeah, exactly.
What is the last pop tune you listened to on your phone?
I don't remember what the last one is, but you know what I've been listening to a lot in terms of pop tunes? It's old. I've been listening to I Need You by America.
It's a classic.
It's a great song, yeah.
I think that it's important to remember that we're not all... Classical music isn't boring. It isn't even classical, actually. Mm-hmm. And the fact that cross-pollinates into pop culture, and the things that you're writing and that all these other composers we've been talking about are writing are relevant to the world we live in, because you're kind of woven into the fabric of what's going on anyway, as is pop music as well. I love seeing people meld those things together in an artful way. And if you want to hear more of Joseph's music, by the way, head to josephsowa.com. There's a whole page here that's got YouTube links and SoundCloud. What's like the first thing we should listen to on this website, Joseph?
I think the first thing you should listen to on that website is that Apple Fantasy that I told you about. It's a fantastic piece. And I had so much fun writing that piece. And Hub New Music, they're great performers. So just everything about that, go check that piece out. That'd be what I'd recommend.
I want to check out Wasabi for string quartet just because I love the name of it. And I also love what is going on with Space Invaders for string orchestra.
So Space Invaders was a piece that I wrote for middle school orchestra. And that was a lot of fun to write because as I mentioned to you earlier in this interview, the first piece that I wrote was actually for middle school orchestra. And so it's just silly. It's this goofy fun piece.
Night Flocks of Angels trumpet for violin and piano. Oh man, I'm kind of disappointed. Not a trumpet piece, huh?
I think I could actually turn that into a trumpet piece fairly easily. That is a movement from that big longer piece that I mentioned earlier, the Field Guide to Natural History. All of it had all of the movements of that Field Guide to Natural History. They had all these like convoluted pun titles.
Okay, I have to just share a few more of these with our listeners.
Go for it.
Here are some more compositions that Joseph has written that are available to hear right now on his website. I love these titles. Here we go. Fangled Contraption. We have Brain Siphon for pre-recorded electronics and stereo, I guess. Okay. Mm-hmm. There is Sunshine in My Soul Today for four-handed piano. That's cool. And A Lake and a Ferry Boat for high voice and piano. I have to listen to all of these. I think your gift of naming these pieces in a way that makes me want to click on them is brilliant. And, maybe that's part of marketing too, is naming something in a way that's intriguing.
No, I think so for sure. I mean, again, this is one of these things that like composers are really bizarrely insecure about. Is they're like, I have a lot of peers who write really great music who are deliberately trying to write these obscure titles because they're like, oh, I don't want audience members to, I don't want to tell audience members how they should feel about it. And it's like, well, on the one hand, it's like, yeah, I can kind of sympathize to that. But it's like, look, an audience member is going to feel, if you write a piece about baseball and, this reminds some audience member of something complete, they're going to feel that anyway. You don't need to put in an obscure title just to ensure the fact that they're not going to, that you're not going to be unduly influencing them.
Oh, there you heard it there. Name your piece is something people can get excited about and write music, push the envelope. And look, here's a challenge that Joseph's putting out for you. If you're a performer, go write something. I'm not going to promise that there'll be a premiere on the Honesty Pill podcast anytime soon, but it's back in the corner of my mind. So Joseph, thank you so much for taking some time. This episode will probably be in January. You're probably listening to it in January. So Wizarding School is opening soon. If you want to hop on a call with Joseph or get an email out to him, go to josephsowa.com. Anywhere else we can reach you or find out about your work?
So my email address is just joseph@josephsowa.com. So that'd be probably the best way to reach out to me is like that.
And you have a mailing list, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. I do, yeah.
Awesome. All right, so subscribe to Joseph's mailing list. Here is stuff. And I'm excited to see where you take all this. And hopefully one day soon, I'll be performing your music at the LA Phil. We could go out for a drink afterwards.
Thanks, Chris. That'd be great.
Awesome. All right, we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Yep, sure thing. Take care.
Big thanks to Joseph Sowa for spending some time with us today and giving us a peek behind the scenes at how a professional composer works, where all that music on your stand actually comes from, and maybe even giving us all a nudge to get our own music out there. Maybe it's time I finally wrote that sonata for viola and hatchet I've been thinking about. I don't know. I'll get back to you on that one. Please go check out Joseph's work at josephsowa.com and look for the Wizarding School of Composers announcement because that will be coming right up. Okay, that's it from me today. This has been the Honesty Pill Podcast, episode 26. You can find out more at honestypill.com. And I want to thank those of you who have taken a moment to review this podcast. It means the world to us and helps other people just like you connect with everything that is going on over here at Honesty Pill Mission Control. Okay, I'm out of here. Hope you have a great new year. Thanks for listening. See you next time.